now. And yeah, just while the speakers are sharing their 5 things, if you could stay muted, that'd be really helpful. We will have hopefully 15-20 minutes at the end as well after the talks, just to ask questions about the books. So if we just ping some questions in the chat as we go along, that'd be really helpful for me. So last time on 5 Things, I think we've got a couple of the speakers present here as well. We have Brianna, Mike and Phil share their key takeaways from Be More Pirate, How to Take Smart Notes, and Tiny Habits. And that recording is on YouTube. I think the link's on our 5 Things Twitter account. This is the 8th, oh, sorry, one sec. This is the 8th 5 Things. We've managed to cram a lot in. We've got quite a pile of extraordinarily interesting books there. So there's a few recordings of these talks as well. Sorry, I'm just admitting people, more Francises to the room as well whilst I'm trying to talk. And yeah, so we've managed to cram a lot in, and here's all a lovely montage of our lovely speakers that we've had so far, and I'm delighted to add 3 new speakers to this rather illustrious group. Yeah, just before a sort of slight technical hitch, I can explain to everyone that's that's just joining the call, I totally screwed up the Zoom link, and it had Frances, my wife's name, encoded into the link. So if you join, you are more than likely to be called Frances, which is weird. So there's little 3 dots next to your profile, your picture, your video, sorry, if you desire to change that name, up to you. But first up is the wonderful Janine Matheson. Janine heads up Codebase Sterling, and she's also a freelance creative producer, sometimes artist curator, and is board trustee at Creative Cultural Skills UK and Tinderbox Collective. I didn't know that. Janine is also mum to the amazing Finlay, and today Janine will share her 5 things on Sabotage. Janine.
Thanks, Andy. Hi, everybody. Really lovely to see you all. And yeah, thanks to Andy for that nice intro, and also just for inviting me to chat about my 5 takeaways from this book. It's been a bit of a year for everyone, hasn't it? That's a bit of an understatement, really. You know, everyone's been affected by pandemic and political stuff, and yeah, just general turmoil, really. And I think with feeling so kind of out of control, I've been feeling quite overwhelmed recently. So I wanted to talk about this small book, Sabotage, because it's been helping me to be a lot kinder to myself and sort of recognize more of my kind of knee-jerk behaviors that are not doing me any favors right now. So I'm hoping that some of the things I share might resonate with some of you too, and give you some sort of tips. So I've chosen to talk about Sabotage by Gannon, which I inhaled recently. And starting and finishing a book quickly for me in itself was quite a pleasant experience, as I've got a really bad habit of starting books and sort of getting waylaid and distracted into other books. So I thought if anyone was interested, I'd also kind of shout out a few other books that I'm reading. So So Hormonal, a collection of essays on hormones, published by Monstrance Regiment. And I noticed that the lovely Emily, who's one of the editors and a past speaker of 5 Things, is actually here as well. So I'm sure she'll chat more about that if you need to ask her any more about her book. I'm also trying to get through Small is Beautiful, a study of economics as if people mattered. I've been trying to read that book off and on for like a year. So yeah, persevering. And I've just started The Good Ancestor, How to Think Long-Term in a Short-Term World by Roman Krajisnik. So yeah, just some other things that I've been kind of thinking about. So yeah, anyway, back to Sabotage. Yeah, Andy, if you can move the first slide. So this is a book about self-sabotaging tendencies and tips to overcome them. Emma Gannon describes herself as a multi-hyphenate. She's a bestseller writer, a journalist, and host of popular Control-Alt-Delete podcast about careers. In 2019, she wrote the first few hundred lines of an essay about self-sabotage, kind of prompted by chats with friends, and it evolved into being published by the Pound Project. And I thought the Pound Project is a interesting thing to flag as well. It's a small independent publisher with a very cool business model. They support and crowdfund one writer's work at a time. So they let writers kind of dip their toes into new territory of writing and produce something a bit more in depth, yet short form. The success of this essay led her to create an online course with Skillshare, and also to create this book, which I've read. I love that the initial idea kind of organically grew into different forms and can be accessed by fellow saboteurs in the way that kind of works for them, to get the most out of what she's kind of talking about. I like this book as it was a collection of real examples of Emma's own saboteur tendencies, which are really, really relatable. And this is alongside viewpoints from clinicians and also crowdsourced stories from real folk. So it feels really close. It had a really nice flow, it's concise, and it gives you lots of starting points to further any research if you're interested in going kind of deeper into self-sabotaging behaviours. And the best part for me was it gives me actual practical tips and advice throughout the book, so they're really easy to sort of implement. I find this book ultimately to be really hopeful and comforting. I learned about the four most common types of sabotage, which are perfectionism, procrastination, inner critic, and fear of promotion. And I also learned that some forms of sabotage can actually be helpful, having always thought it being really, really negative. So that this kind of form of sabotage can act as a protection for yourself, and that we can also kind of recognize these behaviors and unlearn them. So some self-sabotaging tendencies are quite subtle in how they manifest in an individual. And personally, I hadn't realized some of these self-sabotage behaviors in myself before. So it's been quite kind of enlightening about how to sort of change tack. According to the clinical psychologist, Dr. Helen Hendrickson, self-sabotage can apply to the more mundane in our day-to-day. And if anything, these are the things to watch more closely as they kind of slip through the net of everyday life, but ultimately make us feel really rubbish. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So number one takeaway, we can be our own worst enemy or our best supporter. It's a choice. In getting to this morning, I'm going to be completely honest with you, like lay myself bare. I had a full sabotage meltdown. I've known about talking today for ages. Andy asked me ages ago to select a book and talk about it. However, every time I sat down to sort of actually formulate my thoughts and sort of think about what I was going to talk about, procrastination and inner critic vibes really came at me full blast. So just to give you an example of what some of the things I've been speaking to myself about the last kind of 48 hours, I should have been preparing for this ages ago, which will stop me starting. I'm not smart enough. I don't have anything to say that's worth listening to. I'm going to be rubbish at talking about this book. I should research this more. I don't know what I'm talking about. I think I'll clear up my Google Drive. That'll make me feel better. I'll go through my inbox, 13,000 emails later. Now I'm scrolling Instagram. I should read the book again. I should maybe download the audiobook and listen to it again. I've made such scribbly notes, I can't read them. How am I going to formulate this talk? Oh my God, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. It goes on and on and on and on and on. So Emma describes how perfectionist tendencies isn't just about things that are absolutely perfect or you're striving for perfection. It's also about that very basic fear of failing. And sometimes it can be completely debilitating to the point that it stops you from starting or finishing something. We talk ourselves out of something so we don't even try, that we're too scared to fail or look stupid in front of colleagues or friends. And that's definitely something that I feel in different ways. In the part about procrastination, she writes about the big and small avoidances. She includes a quote from Lizzie's Skirnix in her written piece, This Should Be a Word, which really chimed with me about my experience of procrastination and sabotage. She said, we're in dire need of a word for that email you put off responding to because you want to give it your full attention and thus never answer it, giving the sender the impression that you don't care, when in fact it's the most important thing in your inbox. And my my version of this is definitely sending cards. I remember a birthday or whatever it is, buy the card, then I can't think of what to write. I want it to be really meaningful and really thoughtful, so that person knows how much I care about them. So I put it on the table and to come back to it later. I keep looking at it, start to feel guilty, then eventually I rush something a bit blah and send it and feel just generally rubbish about the whole thing. So a good thing is that Emma doesn't leave you hanging in these kind of discomfort. The book identifies the kind of destructive behaviours that are quite common and explores what might be underneath, the kind of why questions that you can start asking yourself. And she shares tips on how to break these things down, how to help you choose a different way, or stop it starting in the first place. It mainly introduces the thought that if we weren't so harsh to ourselves, instead we were kind and supported ourselves like we would a friend or a colleague, if we became a supporter rather than an enemy, can you imagine how freeing that potentially could be? We'd wait so little time on things. If you can go to the next slide. So I picked out rehearsing as a form of self-sabotage, mainly because it's something that I didn't really link to sabotage, so I just wanted to share it. Rehearsing as a form of imagining the worst case scenarios, from small things to big things. We can worry about something and go into crazy detail about the scenario kind of unraveling in our minds. And a thing that's happening for me at the moment is I'm potty training my toddler, Finley, and I'd be lying if I said I haven't worried about, like, you know, are we starting this too soon? Are we going to say something wrong at the wrong moment? Is this going to damage him in some way? Is he going to be 20 and still in his pants? Still refusing to wear pants even? You know, all these kind of crazy thoughts that, that I've had about this potty training thing. I mean, I joke with this example, but rehearsing can also be, you know, about serious things like death and illness and your job, your relationship, lots of different things. Emma points out that all this imagined future kind of doom planning is just a way that you're trying to plan out, to rationalize and kind of prepare for if something did happen, what would you'd have a strategy ready for it. But the crazy thing about it is most of these things tend to be quite out of the blue or left field. And all this worrying right now is just robbing you of like joy and thinking about other things in your presence. So reading this really hit me hard because I do this a lot and I hadn't even really connected it to a form of sabotage. I just thought it's, you know, you're just mind playing out about things. So now that I've got a name for it and I can recognize it, I'm hoping that I'll be much quicker to snap myself out of those kind of things. So if you can move to the third slide. So distracting ourselves to death, it's time to look our issues in the eye. Emma talks about avoidance of working through our feelings, which is kind of classic saboteur behavior. The distractions of kind of endlessly scrolling through social media, picking up your phone first thing in the morning to look at the news or answer emails without kind of having time to digest what they're asking of you. Just trying to soothe anxiety with distraction or trying to over busy ourselves. It just ends up building this feeling of unease, and those problems don't really go away. So a quote that I picked out from the book is actually a quote from Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way, and says, but do you know how old I'll be by the time I learn to really play the piano, to act, to paint, write a decent play? And the answer is yes, the same age you'll be if you don't. So basically you should just start working on the thing and stop kind of finding all the things to distract you from actually getting started. Emma writes about how best not to ignore these inner kind of conflicts and try to work out what might be going on underneath. She talks about how the discomfort that we feel can help us to transform, that even taking little steps forward will help us move much further forward quicker. And an example of this might also be those kind of horrible feelings that you feel of envy or jealousy when you see someone you know or you admire doing really well. And the crap bit that you feel, that kind of inner critic, is that feeling of comparison, or that you should be further ahead with your life or whatever it might be. But Emma kind of within the book shows you tips to actually kind of harness some of those feelings and revisit them more positively, so that actually you can use some of those feelings of discomfort to fuel and motivate yourself to make some changes. The fourth slide, please. So I've put "we'll get it wrong" from time to time, and that's okay. In the book, Emma writes about how self-sabotage can actually be useful at times, kind of like what I've just referenced. It can alert us to something that we might be avoiding to help us grow and learn new things about ourselves. And even if we mess up that specific time, it can help us to actually do something different the next time. So the inner critic and negative self-talk is a big element of sabotage behaviour. Again, this can stop you from starting the task or the project, or give you a skewed view of what the situation actually is. Mostly it's about yourself trying to protect yourself. Protecting yourself from criticism or disappointment, or just that fear of failing and making a right arse of yourself. At Codebase, where I work, we talk about lifelong learning a lot and being endlessly curious. And part of the startup culture is that sometimes you'll fail or mess up, but that's part of testing your ideas and pivoting and creating a better product or a service. So I'm around that philosophy all the time, and I understand it and what the relevance of it is. But sometimes I still worry about messing up or making a mess. It can be quite kind of a vulnerable feeling. So how we talk to ourselves internally about failing really can affect the life that we live and the way that we fear about failing. Emma gives us practical tips on how to give your inner critic a name and a voice, and prepare kind of responses, almost rebuttals, for your inner critic, so that when something crops up and you're talking negatively to yourself, you can kind of say, look, I know you're trying to protect me, but I've got this and I can do it. And you choose to let those kind of feelings go and move on confidently. And it's felt a little bit silly doing this, I'm not going to lie, but I find that the more I do it, the quicker I'm sort of adopting that. And it's much, much easier to sort of wash away those kind of thoughts that used to kind of get me quite stuck. So the last slide. So you have everything inside to keep the fire burning, and it's an endless resource. And I really like thinking about that. That's one of the lines from the book. As I said from the beginning, I find this book to be really hopeful. It presents the different ways that people can sabotage things that they care about deeply, like their creativity, their relationships, their career, their work. Or it might be something smaller, like sending a birthday card late, or everyday things that we tend to sabotage or avoid. What it's helped me is to name these behaviours, and that's what Emma's provided me, a kind of structure to do that. It leads you to do some inner work that you need to do. It's not an easy thing, it's hard, and sometimes it feels difficult and uncomfortable. But the book provides real stories that you can relate to, and arms you with the tips you need on how to address your inner saboteur. This book has helped me to question the things that are not quite as they seem, and that my inner voice isn't always looking out for me, and I can choose, instead of it being an enemy, to be a supporter. So to sometimes sort of take a pause before reacting, or going back into set patterns and remember how we persevere in spite of things. So we can start to, or more often, recognize what are your own forms of self-doubt and identify the types of things that are holding you back. And that'll help you to take the steps to loosen its grip on you. Finally, if we spoke more kindly to ourselves with compassion and care, like we do to our friends and our colleagues, we might not have the need for these weird habits and quirks. And I don't know, do you want me to do the last slide of just reading them out? Okay. So my 5 perhaps slightly waffly and all interconnected takeaways is we can be our worst enemy or our best supporter. And I think it's a choice, and we have to recognize that it's a choice. Rehearsing is a form of self-sabotage, which I didn't really know before, and maybe some of you will relate to that and kind of bat it out the way next time we start doing some crazy thoughts. Distracting ourselves to death, it's time to look at our issues in the eye. I've started putting my phone not in my bedroom so that I don't start reading horrible news stories in the morning. First thing, I can have a cup of coffee and recalibrate before I go into that zone. And 4, we'll get it wrong from time to time, and that's okay. And I think that's just about that we have to get comfortable with messing up sometimes and failing sometimes. And even with this talk, it's not perfect. It's pretty wishy-washy at times, probably, but I'm hoping that, you know, it's honest. It's an honest account of how I feel about these things. So hopefully it'll be received okay. And 5, you have everything inside to keep the fire burning, and it's an endless resource. And I think that's about recognizing that we're actually kind of responsible for how we react to things or how we approach things. And it can feel really tough sometimes, and we do need help and support sometimes, but ultimately we can choose to be a lot kinder in how we talk to ourselves. Thank you.
That was wonderful, Janine. Thank you so much. I've got, applause coming at you from everywhere. That was truly wonderful. That's a bit too much for this morning, Janine. That hit right home. We're probably running behind a little bit, so if you've got any questions no, please don't say sorry. that was so wonderful. But it was more just to say that if you've got any questions for Janine, it might be worth having a chat about that in the chat. Hopefully we'll have a little bit of time to cover that at the end as well. And just a quick note for anyone that's joined recently, I did make a bit of a mistake with the Zoom link and encoded my wife Francis's name into the link. So if you use that link, you're called Francis Irvin, and you can might want to change that with the little 3 dots in your video profile. Anywho's, let's move on. So next up we have Arusa Qureshi, and yep, that's right. Sorry, I'm just getting the running order. So Arusa is a writer and editor based in Edinburgh with a particular focus on music diversity and accessibility within arts and culture. She was formerly editor of The List, and her work has appeared in Bella Caledonia, Galdem, The Guardian, Goldflake Paint, and more. She's also just additionally on the board of the Scottish Music Centre and in the Scottish Music Industries Association Advisory Group. So Arusa is going to share her key takeaways from On the Other Side of Freedom, The Case for Hope. Arusa.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. If you can at any point, just shout, because my internet can be a bit dodgy sometimes. Thanks so much for inviting me today, Andy. And thanks, Janine. That was really, really interesting, and definitely a book I'm going to totally read after this. So the book I'm talking about today is DeRay Mckesson's On the Other Side of Freedom. And this book was first published in 2018. I read it in 2019, but I really felt like the events of this year encouraged me to pick it back up and reread it, and also other books in a similar kind of topic and a similar theme. So I'm just going to read you a bit of the blurb on the back, because it gives you a really good introduction to it. So 5 years ago, DeRay Mckesson quit his job as a school teacher, moved to Ferguson, Missouri, and spent the next 400 days on the streets as an activist, helping to bring the Black Lives Matter movement into being. So next slide, please, Andy. This is a book about resistance, justice and freedom, and it's also a portrait of a movement from the front lines. So for people that maybe aren't as familiar with DeRay Mckesson, he's an activist and he's a key figure and a key voice in the Black Lives Matter movement. And he first came to prominence in 2014 when he joined the protests against the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And like I said, he was really on the front lines. He was one of the people to really document and spread what was happening on social media. So he's been a very vocal critic of police brutality and one of the many people that have been involved with bringing Black Lives Matter to the forefront discussions around racism and around police violence. So this book is divided into 12 chapters, and each chapter communicates lessons that he's learned through his journey, not just in terms of protests, but just generally in life. So it's not just about activism and protest, it's also partly a memoir, and each essay kind of delves into his mind and his thoughts on things like love and his homosexuality and his childhood. So it's really, really moving, and it's not just for the political and social justice elements, but also because of the personal anecdotes. So loads of things have happened, obviously, since this book was written. So rereading it now, it just kind of felt really important to me, and I think the lessons in it are worth reiterating and worth thinking about. So next slide, please, Andy. The first takeaway from this is it's important to stand for something. So this book was important to me because it really educated me on things relating to the early days of the Black Lives Matter movement and things that I really wasn't aware of. But I guess it's also important for me to say that I can't, for like a minute, relate to DeRay's experiences. I'm not Black and I'm not American, so I can't claim to understand fully that experience. But where I can relate is as a person of color and as someone for whom racism is just a kind of fact of life, really. And I guess in the past 6-ish months, I've been really inspired by both the Black Lives Matter movement and also just the kind of the effects of COVID in terms of things like job losses. And I felt more motivated and more energized in terms of anti-racist work. And as Andy said in the introduction, I do a lot of writing and research related to diversity in the arts. And I guess I'm just really determined that the steps that have already been taken in terms of diversity and inclusion and anti-racist work are all those steps will not just be swept aside and forgotten, and we won't have to just start again because of everything that's happened with COVID. But at the same time, and speaking to various people, I feel like this pause has really allowed us to kind of take stock, and it's been good for these kind of discussions. And in some areas, it feels like, you know, people really care and really want change more than ever. So it's important to stand for something, and DeRay Mckesson obviously stood for something and believed in it so much that he literally put his body on the line. And in one of the chapters, he talks about how in August, September, and October of 2014, it was literally illegal to stand still on the streets of Ferguson. I didn't know about this. I don't know if other people do, but it was called the 5-second rule. And basically anyone that was stood still for more than 5 seconds was arrested. And it was their way to wear out the protesters. So basically they just walked day and night and, you know, proved that they couldn't be worn out. And that's always really stayed with me. And I kind of always feel like constantly in awe of the activists that have been involved in Black Lives Matter, because, you know, they really do prove that standing for something can make a difference and can lead to real action and real change. Next slide, please, Andy. So my second takeaway is a quote from near the beginning of the book. And it's, hope is a belief that our tomorrows can be better than our todays. Hope is not magic, hope is work. And throughout this book, DeRay, he details the fight and what's been achieved and what still needs to be accomplished. But I guess the key thing really is that there is so much work still to be done. And he really challenges readers to think about their actions in terms of social justice. And he encourages people who are willing to learn that even though it might be a difficult and uncomfortable conversation at first, it's necessary to begin engaging in any action. And I guess the point he's making with that quote is that, sure, it's great to be hopeful for a future where Black people aren't killed by the police, but hope in this context is more a kind of driving force. And in that same kind of part of the book, he calls hope a precursor to strategy. So you need that to even begin your efforts. It's not just luck and it's not just optimism. It's, like I said, the driving force behind what role you play in making change. And hope from people who have every reason not to be hopeful. For example, people that are experiencing racism and police brutality. That hope is really what fuels real change. Next slide, please, Andy. So my third takeaway from this book, it takes a lot of sacrifice to lead a movement. I've already told you a bit about DeRay and some of the things that he's done, but a highlight for me in this book was really a chapter where he breaks down with statistics instead of anecdotes the data that his organization has collected in terms of regarding police brutality. It just shows how much work goes into organizing and how much thought and research and just background work is involved on top of all the action. And over the years, he's been arrested. He's been the subject of plenty of hate online and in person, and he's also been a kind of scapegoat for certain things. So quite recently, he was in the news because he was sued by a police officer who was injured in a protest back in 2016. And basically what happened was a random protester threw something at a police officer and the police officer was injured. And because DeRay had organized the protest, he was held responsible. And obviously this is really problematic because if he was found to be personally liable for this violence that occurred at the protests, then it would potentially make it difficult, or it would make activists reluctant to organize future protests. But thankfully, just a few weeks ago, the Supreme Court ruled in his favor, and they sided with him, and they sided with the argument that anything else would be an attack on the right to protest, which is good news. But he has sacrificed so much, and he's been in danger a number of times for what he believes in and for the betterment of our movement. And I guess through his sacrifice and the sacrifice of others on the front line of the movement, he's encouraging people to work to dismantle the legacy of racism and kind of imagine the best of what is possible. Next slide, please, Andy. My fourth key takeaway is something that I think about quite a lot. And it's sometimes when you don't see yourself in the world, you start to think that you don't exist. And this is from the start of a chapter where he's discussing his homosexuality and how he didn't ever see romance between gay men on TV before he was an adult. But this chapter is really personal, and he discusses like his personal trauma and things that have happened to him in his life that are really horrible. But that quote in particular is really relevant, really universal, I guess, especially for people of color, because it's just true. I mean, if you don't see yourself on TV and films and in magazine and books, whatever, you do start to think that you don't exist or you're not worthy of that space. I guess in the context of activism and protest, DeRay saying that we're stronger when we make space for people on our team who didn't think that they had a place. So he says later on that as an organizer, he feels it's his job to listen more instead of forcing people to speak up or telling other people to be quiet. And I guess in terms of my work in the arts and in journalism, I think about this quote a lot, and really it's about creating space for different identities and ensuring that people know that they're valued and needed. Next slide, please. This is my final takeaway, and it's probably the most important one. Making your voice heard among the voices that wish to silence you is as important as ever. And this is really important, especially when you consider where we are right now in the world and just things like the rise of white supremacy and right-wing rhetoric. And sometimes it can really feel like you're shouting into the void when you're vocal or when you're open about what you consider to be an injustice or something that's problematic. But it's never been more vital that we keep going and that we, whether that's through direct protest or more like behind the scenes change. And I just want to read you a quote from the book that I just thought was, always really stays with me. And DeRay says, "Protest is telling the truth in public. Sometimes protest is telling the truth to a public that isn't quite ready to hear it. Protest is, in its own way, a storytelling. We use our bodies, our words, our art, and our sounds both to tell the truth about the pain that we endure and to demand the justice that we know is possible. It is meant to build and to force a response." Now, like as I said before, I've been worried about how things like COVID will affect anti-racist work, but at the same time, I'm also hopeful that people are taking certain things more seriously, but we are really just at the beginning in my mind. And I want to just finish with a quote from an interview that DeRay did with The Guardian about Ferguson, and I think it's a great quote. He said, "The police have killed more people since the protest, not less. That is the sobering reality because it's also a reminder that we have so much work to do. The civil rights movement was decade-long works of activism, so I'm not discouraged." And I guess like DeRay, despite all the horrible things that have happened and keep happening, I'm not discouraged either. And yeah, those are my takeaways. So just to reiterate, it's important to stand for something. Hope is the belief that our tomorrows can be better than our todays. Hope is not magic. Hope is work. It takes a lot of sacrifice to lead a movement. Sometimes when you don't see yourself in the world, you start to think that you don't exist. Making your voice heard among the voices that wish to silence you is as important as ever.
That was wonderful, Arusa. Thank you so much. Round of applause for Arusa. Backed by... Oh, don't muck about, do we? Heavy issues this morning. I'd love to talk about that more. I'm going to move straight on just our last talk with Lynsey, our final talk in the trilogy of Sabotage, Hope, and Fear. Again, we are going to be a bit shorter time, so please ask Arusa questions in the chat, and I'm sure she won't mind you reaching out to her on whatever social channel if you've got any further questions about that. But our final talk today is from Lynsey May. Lynsey is a freelance writer and online content creator who also works 2 days a week for Scottish Book Trust as well. She's written copy for major brands and arts charities, won prizes for her fiction, and spent too much time reading thanks to her role as books editor at the list. Can you spend too much time reading? Maybe, I don't know. But Lynsey's going to share her thoughts on All That Remains, A Life and Death. Lynsey.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, thanks for having me here. Can you hear me okay?
Sure can, yeah.
Yes, amazing. Yeah, and thank you to Janine and Arusa. Those both sound absolutely amazing. And as everyone's been saying, it's been a bit of a year, so I chose a pretty intense book just to continue that. So I tried to give my points a bit of a positive spin to help as much as I can. So could I have the first slide, please, Andy? Amazing. So this book is basically about the personal life and professional experiences of a forensic anthropologist. And it's by no means Black's first book. Like, she's written many, including some really significant textbooks and research, and a new one quite similar to this called Written in the Bone, which I'm really excited to check out. But this is the first one that came to my attention because while it contains lots of like really interesting scientific observations, it's also a kind of personal account. And it's basically a kind of memoir with a strong focus on her career, explaining why she was drawn to the path she followed and some of the events that most shaped her professionally and obviously kind of personally. From her job in a butcher's shop to the absolute kind of phobia of rodents that meant lab work was just off the table for her. So most people take their jobs home with them to a certain extent. Lots of us don't have much choice there right now, but it's very interesting to read the kind of personal struggle, or I guess for her kind of ability to retain this kind of scientific level of clarity while also giving space to this sort of empathy, compassion and curiosity and respect for rituals that kind of make us human. Can I have the next slide, please, Andy? So first thing that I took away from it is forensic anthropologists help us find answers when answers might be the best that we can hope for. So first of all, like, to be honest, the actual first thing that I learned was what a forensic anthropologist is. From my plentiful consumption of like the occasional crime novel and way more TV shows about crime that of kind of questionable quality, some of them, but I had a pretty woolly idea of what what forensics is. As basically someone will come in, work out how someone died and maybe who they are after a crime is discovered. And this is kind of broadly true, but Black's job and her job title relates to a kind of subcategory of the field of physical anthropology, which is basically a study of humans through an evolutionary lens. And for her, it's like where the kind of tenets of skeletal archaeology and anthropology can be used to identify victims of kind of not only crimes, but like unexplained deaths or natural disasters or of kind of very cold cases. So what did I take away from like that? Well, basically, first of all, don't believe everything you see on TV, which I kind of hope I might have learned already, but also how important her role is in kind of criminal proceedings, but also in basically matching a body to a name. Those two things can become disconnected for all sorts of reasons, and there can be all sorts of questions about, what happened to who and why. And sadly, if a forensic anthropologist is involved, like, the worst has already happened. But for many people, having an answer or confirmation or a body to cremate or bury or honor is a really important part of that grieving process. So sometimes answers are the best thing that we can hope for, and it's important that we have them. And the next thing, if I could have the next slide, please. Some things are predetermined. So this book doesn't really go into a kind of nature or nurture kind of debate at all. But what Black really does underline is the fact that while there are like many, many variables in humans as a species and in the life that any one person might follow, there are some really basic things that are kind of predetermined. And the first and biggest and most obvious is that all of us are living organisms. And one day, that we won't be living organisms. And this plays out, but it plays out in lots of other ways. That's the most basic, but there's things like the fact that, after a certain age, we all start to shrink. And it's not because we just start to have terrible posture. It's actually the cells that are in the cartilage in our joints only renew a certain number of times. And as the cells go and the cartilage shrinks, we shrink with it. And I think it's just really amazing that there's some things that are kind of pre-programmed into ourselves that certainly at the moment, who knows, the science is progressing, but at the moment there's things in ourselves that we just can't change. They're predetermined. And I take some comfort in it because I obviously don't want to be limiting, and I think we should all reach for the moon or shoot for the stars or whatever, but accepting that we as people are working within some sort of predetermined framework is, I think, kind of comforting. So we can't change or control everything, but we can do wonderful things with what we do have. And then the next thing, for next slide, please, Auntie. Thank you. You've done it already. Basically, we're global souls with local bodies. So like my point here is maybe like a little bit of a reach, and I'm definitely paraphrasing some of Black's book, but definitely her work really opened up to me some understanding of how accurately we can be placed in a certain part of the world during a certain time period by markers within our body that they're not noticeable to the average human eye. A really basic example of this that it is or would be visible would be that for someone like me, someone would probably be able to tell if I'd been on holiday somewhere sunny, if I'm covered in freckles in the middle of Scottish winter. But even that, it only works if you know me well enough to have an idea of how freckly I normally am. So, but what Black's book was really revealing is that just a much more detailed look at the sort of you are what you eat kind of mentality. She explains that even the water we drink percolates through specific geological formations that are particular to one place in the world, and it has signatures that are transferred to the chemical makeup of our tissues. So, for example, the most obvious ones are your nails or your hair, and then that those can be identified and tell people where you are at any specific time. And that's probably one that I have kind of seen happening on TV, but I think it's an amazing just thing to happen. And the fact that it's not only things that can turn up, like short-term things that would be in your hair or your nails, but there might be trace elements of chemicals in your lymph nodes or in your lungs or your skeleton that could, say where you've traveled throughout your life, which I think is just amazing. But I think the thing I really took away from it is that no matter how global our outlook is, and I think that it is amazing how global it is becoming these days, and it is, we're also really affected by our locality, even on a really basic, like cellular level, like even just in a way that we can't control. I think it's really important for our idea of perspective, that even if we feel like we understand what's happening on the other side of the world, we have to think about our own ability to understand it with the position that we're in. Like even just in how much is my perspective colored by where I'm situated right at this second. So the next thing, my fourth thing, is that we may forget more than we remember, and again, that's okay. So Black's book includes the line, "At times I feel that collectively we may have forgotten more anatomy than we remember." And when she's talking about that, she's relating to a very specific method of identification, which is using the pattern of veins and arteries and blood vessels as unique markers to identify different people. And this process was first invented in America more than 100 years ago, or first, as far as we know, more than 100 years ago. And then it kind of disappeared. And then it was sort of reinvented in the UK in the 80s. And again, it just didn't quite pick up. And now in kind of recent years, it's had a little bit of a resurgence, but in the kind of biometric security measures field. But she's been working with police and other experts to make use of these markers and their kind of precedent, these things that have happened in the past, as an alternative means of identification, particularly in cases where the evidence might be photographic. So they can't rely on the usual things like fingerprints or physical markers. They might just be using a picture of the back of someone's hand and use the vein pattern there. I think the really cool thing about this is the idea that it's true that sadly we have forgotten many amazing achievements, not only in anatomy, but just in the world throughout the ages. And also that progress isn't always linear, as in, new isn't always better. I think we all are pretty versed in the kind of planned obsolescence and all the washing machines and fridges and phones that break after a few years. But even though newer isn't always better, then the really comforting thing is the idea that there'll always be minds that are willing to build on what we've had before, like Black's able to use these precedents, these times, these discoveries that other people have made that didn't go anywhere, to then become a new thing that is, solving crimes and helping people these days, which I think is just really amazing. And then the next thing, fifth thing, for me was there are many strands to your story. And it's, I think is the last and most important thing that I took away from the book, apart from the fact that Dame Sue Black is just an absolute total badass and is amazing. There are things that a forensic anthropologist may be able to find out about you that you weren't even aware of yourself, or that you might not choose even to add to your story. Like, in fact, like, science sometimes reveals things that we'd rather not know. Black relates a story of family who, after a tragedy, discovered the fact that the person that a couple of sisters thought were their biological brother was actually adopted. And science doesn't care about secrets. Science is all about facts. But in a way, sometimes, you know, even though those factors might be the truth, they're not the most important thing. The brother was loved by his sisters, and there was no question about it in the years that they shared together, that was the truth. And in the same way, I think, you know, your story might include things that you barely realize or don't know about. Maybe not quite as traumatic, but there's maybe things in our bodies, of the story that our body would tell that we don't know. A forensic anthropologist may uncover a whole load of data about you that's not all that relevant to how you think about yourself, and that's okay. Like, your body tells a story, but it's not bigger than the one that you're sharing, living, being right now. So, like, for example, Sue Black's body will reveal her travel and suggest some of the things she's witnessed throughout her life, the chemicals that she's used. But the memoir itself tells us a completely different side to her story. And every person who knows her personally, or even from TV or any of her books, will have their own sort of little versions of her, or anecdotes about her. So no matter what's written in her remains, like, our story is going to be much bigger. And her work to kind of connect those remains to names, connect the bodies, make sure that the story is told, is just a wonderful way of connecting basically the body of the person that is in the world now. Yeah, and that is my 5 things. So I'll just quickly recap. Basically, forensic anthropologists help us find answers. Some things are predetermined. We're global souls with local bodies. We're forgetting more than we remember all the time, but that's grand. And there are many strands to your story. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lynsey. A round of applause for Lynsey and I. Oh, heavy old talk there. That was wonderful. I quite like the phrase that I might adopt today. I don't know if it's true, but you are where you live. You are where you've been. It's not something I've really thought about at all. That's phenomenally interesting. I'm afraid we've kind of run out of time. We've only got a couple of minutes. I just like, I suppose to round up. Well, firstly, a massive round of applause, virtual round of applause, for our 3 speakers today. They're like truly wonderful talks, and for me, just to get those different perspectives on books is really important and enlightening. So, thank you so much, the 3 of you. That was so good. I did want to just sort of quickly, I'm not sure if there's any questions, or I'm trying to navigate this. But yeah, just one of the points Arusa brought up, just the space for different identities and not being seen, like, really hit home with me. And I suppose actually an issue Danny highlighted to me this morning about the Sainsbury's ad in response to that. I can't imagine what it must feel like to feel yourself disappear, but I'm wondering why, you know, why don't folks care about this? If we got any sense, is it just a lack of empathy, or don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, Arusa?
I think it's nice that, you know, people are, like I said, it feels like people care more than they did before, especially because of all the conversations that have happened recently, and just, like I said, the kind of the pause and activity where we've had a chance to think about things more. But like, I don't want to be too negative about it, but I think there are just people that will never change that viewpoint, sadly. and for us, it's more about trying to educate where we can, and yeah, like I said, making sure people are included and that they feel like, you know, they know that they're wanted and they're needed.
I'd love to talk about all three of these books a lot more. I feel exhausted now, as I do every 9 o'clock on a Wednesday morning when we do this, but I'm afraid we'll have to end up there. We will be back for I don't know, talk about there's just one of me, but I'm back for sort of the last 5 things of the year, and December the 16th. I've got Rowan Gnatalik lined up to speak already, and we'll no doubt add another couple of stellar speakers to that. But yeah, once again, thanks so much for joining this morning. I know it's an early start for everyone and contributing to the chat. And yeah, final round of applause for our 3 wonderful speakers. It's a truly inspiring start to the morning. Okay, folks, well, have a wonderful Wednesday. Hope you pick up some of those books, and hopefully catch you next month. Bye.